I'll introduce myself to everyone else in the other workshop regions. I'm Elise LeCompte. I'm the Registrar and Assistant Department Chair at the Florida Museum of Natural History. I'm also the museum's Health and Safety Coordinator, and as that coordinator, my job is to oversee all aspects of health and safety, both for the collections and the staff. This includes development of the museum's emergency preparedness plan, annually updating the plan, writing protocols and procedures, and planning and coordinating our emergency response procedures. Disaster planning has two goals: a contingency plan designed to take effect when an unforeseen event strikes or is imminent, and a longer-term mitigation actions undertaken to minimize the impact of an anticipated event. In order to develop a contingency plan and identify required mitigation actions, we first have to identify the threats to which our institutions are susceptible. According to our text, Building an Emergency Plan, a threat is defined as an indication of imminent danger. That is such a short, innocuous definition for an event that has the potential to be catastrophic if we have not planned properly for its possibility. To know what to plan for, an important first step in the process is to have a good idea of what dangers threaten us and our institutions. Next slide. Threats come from many different sources and in many levels of severity. Some are a result of nature's wrath, but as you can see from this slide, most are man-made. As you can also see, some threats fall into more than one category. For example, a fire can pose a minor threat that only affects part of the facility, or it can be a catastrophic event that affects most or all of the institution, the community, and/or the region. Next slide. Most of the sources of natural threat are well known, and by using our common sense, we can figure out what the results of such a disaster might be at our own institutions. For example, a hurricane will bring some level of wind, water, and possible structural damage. By examining your facilities carefully, you can easily figure out what might happen to your institution. For example, the walls of your structure may be able to withstand the onslaught of wind and water during a hurricane. But what about your roof? What about the building penetrations like windows and doors? For example, the loading dock door is one of the most vulnerable building penetrations. Due to the nature of its construction, it can easily be twisted and/or ripped from the building during storms with high winds or rushing water. Next slide. Some of the man-made sources of disaster are well known and unfortunately may be fairly common to some of us. A busted pipe inside or outside of the building, a leaky roof or window, inadequate wiring, a mold outbreak, or a pet infestation. Next slide. Other threats may never occur to us unless we are actually in the throes of an emergency created by one of these threats. An insect sting causes someone to go into anaphylactic shock. A caterer's hot plate starts a fire. An educational demonstration using an open flame or hazardous chemical goes awry. Next slide. Some man-made threats, like nearby industrial accidents, active shooters, and bomb threats, have only recently invaded the hallowed halls of museums and cultural institutions. Witness the shooting at the Holocaust Museum in 2009. Next slide. In terms of severity, what might have been a minor incident that would have involved only a small part of the facility can quickly become a catastrophic event, leading to the total destruction of the institution without proper emergency planning. Next slide. This slide reiterates some potential threats, natural and human, big and small, that we might have to deal with at some point in our professional careers. Forest brush fires, hail, combustible decorations used for an event, educational demonstrations, or sewage backup, to name a few. While many disasters remain out of our control, The ability to prepare and respond to them properly and effectively is within our control. Next slide. When I first got involved with emergency planning, I was surprised to find out that fire is the #1 threat to cultural institutions. It does more damage than other threat, natural or man-made, both in terms of amount lost and cost. Next slide. This slide shows some of the flood damage that the Randall Research Center headquarters, a Pine Island satellite facility of the Florida Museum of Natural History, suffered as a result of Hurricane Charlie. This is a prep lab at the facility that used to be a garage. A thick, hardened sludge covered the floor and bottom inches of the walls, the furniture, and the equipment that were in the lab. Artifact bags stored on the bottom shelves of racks and cabinets were inundated with water. In this instance, one of the things that we learned was that we had not stored things up high enough off the ground. Next slide. This slide shows roof and chimney damage as well as structural damage to the Randall Research Center headquarters building. Next slide. Biological damage can take several forms, including mold and insect damage. The interior wood of the mask's nose was eaten away by bugs. Pressure was placed on the nose when the mask was picked up, and its remaining thin outer crust broke through. Next slide. There are 3 separate components in assessing potential danger to an institution. Hazard, that is the probability that a disaster will occur. Vulnerability, that is the degree of exposure to a hazard and the amount of loss from a disaster. And risk, that is the probable loss from a disaster as determined by considering the hazards of a location and the vulnerability of the assets located there. Next slide. Risk assessment relies on a hazards and vulnerability analysis, determines acceptable levels of risk, and thereby provides a basis for making decisions about which preventative measures are needed. Without having a personalized assessment of your institution's risks, you won't know what to cover in your emergency preparedness plan. Next slide. Planning for risk management begins with developing a comprehensive list of threats. What major interruptions to business could occur, such as natural disasters or facility collapse? What threats are there to the health and safety of staff and visitors, such as slips, falls, or dangerous chemicals? Are the collections at sudden risk in any way, such as a power failure or theft? The hazard assessment determines the kinds of threats to which an institution is exposed and the likelihood of their occurring. The more ways that a particular event, such as water damage, can occur under different types of circumstances, the greater the probability that it will occur, and thus the greater the risk. When assessing risks, always imagine a worst-case scenario. Next slide. Consider the impact of the event. How damaging will it be to finances, mission, and reputation, and how often does such an event occur? Vulnerability analysis assesses the kind and extent of damage that a given hazard might do. We may be able to do very little to change our exposure to hazards, but we can certainly do a great deal to reduce our vulnerability. Next slide. Reducing vulnerability to disasters involves the following 4 steps: identifying specific hazards, determining board preparedness goals, evaluating structures and their contents, and taking mitigating action to correct deficiencies. Next slide. The probability and incident rate of natural disasters locally or within your region can be determined using data from local, state, regional, and national disaster agencies, including the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which is FEMA, its Declared Disasters by State website, and that is listed as one of the resources on our dedicated C2C website. You can also use the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's website, that's NOAA. and other weather-related websites like Weather Underground. Historical records, personal interviews, and newspaper archives can be useful as well. Next slide. An institutional risk assessment involves a complete examination of an institution's facilities, inside and out, top to bottom, door to door, as well as a critical evaluation of its policies and practices. Hazards can then be systematically identified and analyzed, and priorities for dealing with them can be set. Next, actions to prevent or reduce losses and generally prepare for appropriate responses during an emergency should be developed and implemented. Next slide. In 1994, Robert Waller, then chief of the conservation section of the Canadian Museum of Nature, proposed a model approach to performing a risk assessment. He suggested that cultural institutions use a numeric ranking system to set priorities. By deciding what numbers to assign to the risk and vulnerability variables, staff can come to an agreement on the size and importance of each risk. Presenting the results of this kind of a risk assessment, that is, one with quantitative data, to the institution's leadership can be a powerful way to get them to devote needed resources to risk abatement. Using these results, management can decide where it should apply the institution's resources to achieve the greatest reduction in risk. Next slide. In 2004, historic preservationists, representatives from the business community, and local government leaders in Apalachicola joined forces to conduct an initial risk assessment of the historic resources in the town and develop an integrated action plan for community-wide emergency planning. The committee identified those risks that would have the greatest impact on historic structures and other cultural resources. It identified the following hazards as top priority: flooding, winds, storm surge, urban fire, economic crisis, and lightning. The committee developed ranking criteria and an Excel matrix to assess the relative risk of the 6 hazards to each identified historic resource. A total risk score was calculated, which allowed the various historic resources to be ranked relative to the overall group. Next slide. After completing the risk assessment, the committee developed an action plan to integrate historic preservation concerns into community-wide emergency management planning. Using the identified challenges and needs, the committee formulated a series of short and long-term goals. Short-term goals included actions that could reasonably be achieved before or during the 2005 hurricane season. Long-term goals included actions that would take additional time or resources to complete. Next slide. Some aspects of risk assessment are common sense. For example, most of us are capable of spotting fire hazards like frayed wires, too many extension cords, and a lack of enough fire extinguishers. Most of us can identify leaks from worn-out roofs, poorly sealed windows, and rusted pipes. Some of us may have even seen situations like we see in those photographs in our own institutions. Unfortunately, that's all too common. Next slide. In some cases, it is a good idea to call in experts to help with the risk assessment. Your own facilities manager or maintenance crew, or those from your parent institution. For my museum, that would be the University of Florida Physical Plant Division and the Department of Environmental Health and Safety. You can also call in a police officer to examine security and policies for dealing with violent behavior, a representative from the local fire station crew, a representative from the utility company, a structural engineer, your local state fire marshal, someone from the city, county, or state emergency management agencies, like the Florida Division of Emergency Management, or CERT with a C, or CERT with an S team. one of those teams. And those are the county or state emergency response teams. You can also talk to colleagues who have been through actual emergencies. For many of these folks, this kind of service is part of their job, so you won't actually have to pay them for their help. They would rather help you avert a disaster than have to deal with the actual catastrophe and its aftermath. Next slide. So this was the highlights of the case studies from Chapter 1 of our text, Building an Emergency Plan. These show the identified natural and man-made hazards faced by the highlighted institutions, including hurricanes, floods, fires, earthquakes, windstorms, blizzards, volcanic eruptions, and political demonstrations. And you can peruse these case studies at your leisure. Each one covered several pages in the textbook. Next slide. The end result of a risk assessment is to answer the following questions. What is an acceptable risk? What changes can be made to reduce or mitigate the risk? And which alterations are cost effective? Budgeting for risk management is a balancing act between allocating time and money to policies and procedures that avert bad things, like installing sprinkler systems or training staff in first aid and emergency response, and a balancing act then between insurance to make up for the disasters that happen anyway. Presenting the results of an institution's risk assessment to the institution's leadership, including management and the board, in a format they recognize as relevant to their responsibilities, that is, the preservation of the institution's facilities and collections, can be a powerful way to get them to devote needed resources to risk abatement. Next slide. Setting priorities for recovery related to threats predicted by your risk assessment will determine what resources and supplies might be needed to cope with identified disasters. The larger the disaster, the further afield you have to go to procure resources to deal with it. Minor to moderately sized events that affect only a portion of the institution can be handled with in-house resources, provided that the necessary resources, supplies, designated labor, funds, have been identified, stocked, and set aside. Moderate to larger sized events that impact the entire institution require that resources be garnered from the community, region, or even the state. Community-wide or regional disasters require that resources be procured from the state, region, or even at the national level. It is essential that you identify the source and location of required resources for all of the different types of disasters that you might face well ahead of time. That is, when you develop and update your emergency preparedness plan. If you do not, they will not be available when you need them. Many of us remember horror stories from institutions that did not plan ahead well for the hurricanes. The power was out for months, so there was no HVAC system and no generators available. There was not enough lumber and tarps to cover gaping holes, thereby compromising the institution's structure and security. There were not enough food and drinking water to keep cleanup crews going, and not enough dry towels, plastic bags, and boxes to protect water-soaked objects until they could be transported to conservators. Next slide. You cannot prevent a disaster, but you can drastically reduce its effect on human life and property. Protective measures are steps taken to eliminate hazards or to reduce the effects of threats. Protection is a long process and one that never ends. Those of us involved in emergency preparedness planning must constantly remind our colleagues that protection is a #1 priority. Planning for protection helps reduce the institution's vulnerability and increases its ability to lessen the effects of threats and to recover quickly from any disasters. During the planning process, short and long-term priorities for protective action should be set, and budgetary resources should be targeted. It is easier to request funding for specific projects than for the amorphous goal of quote-unquote emergency preparedness. Next slide. In short, threats to our facilities, our collections, and our visitors and staff are all around us every day, day in and day out. A little prevention goes a long way in saving buildings, preserving our heritage, reducing money spent on repairs, and minimizing recovery time and its associated economic dislocations. With good emergency preparedness planning, we can face what threatens us and our institutions with confidence and come out of a disaster relatively unscathed. Next slide. So now we can do a question and answer session. I'm going to mute my microphone until I get asked a question. Laura Nemmers here at the North Central Florida location asked about the Apalachicola plan, and they had written in a threat of economic crisis. I think what they were getting at, well, I know what they were getting at, is the fact that, say, a downturn in the economy can threaten tourism. And for those of us in Florida and our institutions, that would be a kind of an economic crisis. We had the Gulf oil spill, and people stopped coming to the Gulf Coast, including to Florida. Many institutions suffered. Many historic downtowns suffered because of that lack of tourism dollars. Does anyone in any of the other regions have any questions?
Elise, I've got a question here. Why don't you come up to the mic and ask it directly? We've got somebody coming up to the mic here in West Central Florida. Elise, why don't you give your name?
Absolutely. Good morning, Elise. Thanks for having me on your show. I had a question about hazards, vulnerability, and risk. When we were looking at risk, I saw a lot of those other words under there, under risk, a lot of vulnerability and hazards. What are distinctive marks of each so I can distinguish between them, bring them back to my institution in Lakeland?
Thank you for that question. A hazard really is synonymous with a threat. So that would be, for example, a hurricane would be considered a hazard or a threat. The vulnerability part of it is how would our or your institution stand up to that threat? Is your facility secure? Is it susceptible to flooding with the waters that come with the hurricane? Is it susceptible? So the hazard is the actual incident. That is what is going to affect us: fire, water damage, hurricane, emergency with a visitor, such as an accident. And then the vulnerability is, how are we going to deal with that emergency? Are we prepared to deal with that emergency? Does that answer your question?
Elise, this is Miriam. Joe's gone back to his seat, and his response is yes, thank you. That's very consistent.
I also wanted to mention, and I didn't, that my paper is printed, so I will submit that to our group Connecting to Collections website. I will upload it to the website, so you'll have that as well as the recorded session.
This is Miriam. Thanks for sharing that with everybody, Elise. There's a lot of good definitions in your presentation.
Also, if anyone is interested, I can provide the resources that I cited, such as Robert Waller's article and the information about Apalachicola. That publication is actually quite good. It covers several other case studies throughout the state of Florida and has some excellent information in it.
And this is Miriam popping in again. And of course, a reminder to everyone that the textbook that's been assigned as part of this class, and I will say that for some of you in smaller institutions, you may have moments of saying, you know, these examples from around the world don't really apply to me. I'm just a little museum in a small town. And in effect, what we found is that It was helpful to have the all-inclusive book. It's a Getty publication, and it's really quite excellent. And then there are parts of the book that you will just skim, the parts of the book that deal with the great big institutions that don't really relate to you. Just skip that part or skim that part and really focus on the sections that apply to you. We made the decision that it was better to have what is considered the industry standard, if you will, the really good, solid overview book, and give you a chance to pick and choose. You've got homework assignments, and of course this is professional development. Everyone chooses and decides what part that they do and don't do, and we recognize that and respect that. But just a reminder that that's also available for additional information.
Miriam, this is Elise again. You brought up a really important point related to the textbook, but I would like to say that the case study that I used about Apalachicola, that was a community-wide case study, of course, but the details can be used by you, scaled down somewhat if you're at a small institution, or used in its entirety to help formulate a risk assessment and an action plan for your own institution. The same thing with Robert Waller's work. He focuses a lot on risk assessment for collections, but the ideas and the method for assigning numeric values, quantitative values to your risks can be extended beyond your collections, to your facilities, to your programs, to your policies. So they don't have to be used exactly as presented.
Okay, this is Miriam. I'm going to, huge thanks to Elise LeCompte with the Florida Museum of Natural History for such a great presentation to get us started this morning.